September 12, 2024. Cedar Ridge, Iowa. By 9:15 that morning, the auction yard was already full. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel road. Men in pressed shirts and polished boots stood in small circles, speaking in low, confident tones. A few representatives from agricultural firms checked their phones, glancing occasionally toward the barn, where the auction would take place. Inside, the air felt different, tighter, heavier, because this wasn't just another piece of land being sold. This was Carter Farm, 240 acres of soil that had been worked by one family for over 50 years. And in less than an hour, it was about to belong to someone else. At the front of the room stood Daniel Carter. Clean suit, perfect posture, the kind of man who didn't look like he had ever bent down to touch soil in his life. He stood beside a lawyer and an auctioneer, reviewing documents with quiet precision. Everything was in order. Everything made sense. This was a transaction, a clean one, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Outside the open barn doors, a light wind moved across the fields. Golden rows of late-season corn, shifting gently under a sky that looked too calm for what was about to happen. At 9:32, the auctioneer stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today for the sale of the Carter property." The room settled. Numbers began. Bids came quickly. $900,000, $1.1 million, $1.3 million. No hesitation, no doubt, because land like this didn't stay available long. Daniel watched without emotion. Each number confirmed what he already believed, that this was the right decision, that holding on to something like this any longer would have been a mistake. At one point, $6 million, the room grew quieter. Now only serious buyers remained. Corporate, calculated, certain. And just as the auctioneer raised his hand again, a voice came from the back of the room. Wait, it wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of voice that didn't fight for attention, yet somehow took it. Heads turned. Daniel didn't at first. He kept his eyes forward, because part of him already knew who it was. But there was something about that moment, something in the silence that followed. That forced him to look. And there near the open doors, standing just inside the line of light, was Ethan Carter. Dust on his boots, faded denim shirt, hands at his sides, not stepping forward, not rushing, just standing there, like he had been there the whole time. And maybe he had. The auctioneer hesitated. "Sir, if you intend to bid, I'm not here to bid." That changed everything. A murmur spread through the room, because if he wasn't there to buy, then why was he there? And that question was about to take everyone back. 2 weeks earlier, same land, very different conversation. The house still smelled like old wood and coffee, the kind of place that held on to time. But that morning it felt like something was ending. Daniel stood near this kitchen table, a folder in his hand, flipping through printed documents with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. Valuations, market comparisons, projected returns, all clean, all logical, all final. Ethan sat across from him, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, not arguing, not interrupting, just listening. The lawyer cleared his throat. As it stands, the property has been appraised slightly below regional average. Due to soil inconsistency and irrigation limitations, it's still a good sale. Daniel cut in. Given the current market, Ethan didn't look up. Daniel continued. "We've held on to it long enough." That word, "we," hung in the air for a second, because they both knew it wasn't true. Only one of them had held on to it. The lawyer glanced between them. "Once both parties sign, we can proceed with listing and auction scheduling." Daniel slid the papers forward. "Just sign it. Simple, direct, final." Ethan looked at the documents, then at the table, then somewhere past both of them, out the window, where the field stretched out under late summer light. "You already decided," he said quietly. Daniel didn't deny it. "I made the call that makes sense." Ethan nodded slowly, not agreeing, just acknowledging. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "This isn't about sentiment," he said. "It's about value." That word again. Value. Measured. Calculated. Defined by numbers on paper. Ethan finally looked at him, and for a moment, there was something there. Not anger, not even frustration, just distance. "You don't know what this land is," Ethan said. Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "I know exactly what it is," he replied. I had it evaluated. A mistake. But he didn't know that yet. Because to him, that was understanding. Documentation. Verification. Proof. Ethan looked down again. And that was when Daniel said it. The thing that would stay longer than the deal itself. You've been sitting here for years doing nothing with it, he said. You're not running a farm, Ethan. You're holding on to a memory. Silence. Heavy now. The kind that doesn't move easily. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Ethan didn't respond. And that silence was taken as confirmation. Daniel leaned back slightly, more confident now. This place could actually be worth something, he added. If we let someone who knows what they're doing take over. There it was. Clear, public, final. Not shouted, not cruel in tone, but absolute in meaning. You don't know what you're doing. And in that moment, Ethan Carter was no longer a partner, not even an equal, just an obstacle. And everyone in that room knew it, because humiliation doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes, it only needs truth spoken at the wrong time. Ethan reached forward, picked up the pen, held it for a second, then set it back down. I'll sign, he said. Daniel nodded once, satisfied, because to him, that was the end of the conversation. But what he didn't see was that it wasn't agreement. It was patience, because there was something Daniel had never understood about that land, something their father had known, something Ethan had spent years learning, and it had nothing to do with numbers. William Carter never talked much, not about business, not about plans. But when it came to the land, he spoke differently, like he was describing something alive. This ground remembers, he used to say. Daniel never believed that, because soil to him was data, yield, output, performance. But to Ethan, it was something else. He remembered being 10 years old, walking the lower field with his father, just after a heavy rain. The ground was uneven, hard in some places, soft in others. William knelt down, pressing his hand into the soil. Feel that. Ethan nodded. It holds water here, his father said. Longer than it should. Ethan didn't understand why that mattered, but his father did. He always did. There was a section of the farm about 30 acres near the southern edge that never performed like the rest. Too dry some years, too wet others. Difficult, unpredictable. Daniel saw it as a weakness, something to factor into pricing. William saw it differently. He never sold that section, never leased it out, never pushed it to produce beyond what it wanted to give. Instead, he watched it, adjusted around it, worked with it. And over time, something changed. The soil there became deeper, richer, more stable, not because it was forced, but because it was understood. Ethan spent years in that part of the field, learning without being taught directly, watching patterns, seeing how water moved underground, how certain areas stayed green longer during dry spells, how roots behaved differently there. And slowly, he began to understand something Daniel never saw. This land wasn't inconsistent. It was layered, complex, and full of potential if you knew how to work with it, not against it. But that kind of knowledge doesn't show up in a report. It doesn't fit into clean numbers. And it doesn't convince people who believe everything valuable can be measured. So Ethan never tried. He just kept working, quietly, year after year, while Daniel built a life somewhere else, with spreadsheets, with markets, with certainty. And that was the difference. One of them learned how to read numbers. The other learned how to read land. And as the auction continued that morning, only one of those skills was about to matter, but not in the way anyone expected. After that meeting, everything moved quickly, faster than Ethan expected, faster than he wanted. Within days, listings were prepared. Within a week, the auction was scheduled. And just like that, the land their father had spent a lifetime understanding was reduced to a date, a time, and a starting price. Daniel handled everything. Of course he did. Calls, documents, negotiations, every conversation clean, efficient, professional. Because to him, this wasn't emotional. This was correction, fixing something that had been held on to too long. You'll see, he told Ethan once, standing near the edge of the field. Once it's sold, things will finally make sense again. Ethan didn't respond. He was looking at the ground, boot pressing lightly into the soil, testing it, feeling something Daniel couldn't see. And that silence, Daniel took as agreement, because from his perspective, there was nothing left to argue. The data was clear. The numbers supported it. The land as it stood was underperforming, sections uneven, yield inconsistent, water distribution unreliable. It wasn't prime farmland, not by modern standards. And that was the justification, the reason, the proof. But I need to stop here for a moment, because this is where everything begins to shift. Because what Daniel saw as inconsistency wasn't weakness, it was structure. Hidden, layered, unmeasured. And Ethan had spent years learning how it worked, not by studying reports, but by walking the land, by watching how water moved after rain, how certain areas held moisture longer, how crops behaved differently depending on where they stood. There was a pattern, but it wasn't obvious. It wasn't something you could see from above or calculate from a distance. It had to be felt, understood slowly, and that was something Daniel had never done, because he had left before the land ever revealed itself. Ethan hadn't. He had stayed through the dry seasons, through the years where nothing made sense, through the parts that looked like failure, until they started becoming something else. Because deep beneath that inconsistent soil, there was a layer, a natural basin of denser earth that held water in a way the surrounding land couldn't. Not enough to flood, not enough to notice immediately, but enough to matter, especially over time, especially in the right conditions. And Ethan had been working with that, quietly, for years, adjusting planting patterns, changing how the soil was turned, letting certain areas rest, redirecting water flow in ways no one would recognize unless they were looking for it. He never documented it, never explained it, because there was no point. No one was asking, and even if they were, they wouldn't have believed him, because from the outside, nothing looked different enough, not until it was tested, not until something pushed that land to its limit. And that was the part no one was thinking about. Not Daniel, not the buyers, not the investors standing in that auction room, because they were looking at value in the present, not potential under pressure. And that was the hidden advantage, not a machine. Not a trick, not something flashy, just understanding, depth, time. But the problem with hidden advantages is that they don't matter until And as the auction continued, that moment was getting closer. The bidding crossed 1.7 million, then 1.75. Voices fewer now, sharper, each raise more deliberate than the last. Daniel stood still at the front, calm, confident, because everything unfolding in that room was proving him right. The land had value, high value, and he was the one who had unlocked it. That was how he saw it. That was how everyone saw it, except one person. Ethan, still standing near the back, hands relaxed, eyes moving slowly across the room, not watching the numbers, watching the people, who was bidding, who was hesitating, who understood, and who didn't. Because this wasn't just about selling land anymore. It was about who would control it, and what they would do with it. A representative from a large agricultural firm raised his hand again, 1.8, a small shift in the room. That number mattered. It pushed the value into a different category, a different level of commitment. The auctioneer nodded. Do I have 1.85? Silence. Just for a second, but long enough to feel. And that was when Ethan stepped forward. Not rushing, not dramatic. Just one step, then another, until he was no longer part of the background. And that's when people started noticing. A few faces turned, a few whispers passed. Is that? Yeah, that's him. The one who stayed. The one who didn't say pourquoi. The one who didn't matter. At least that's what they thought. And what happened next was the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. Because Ethan wasn't there to stop the auction. He wasn't there to argue. And he definitely wasn't there to bid. He was there for something else entirely. Something that didn't show up in numbers. Something that didn't fit into contracts. Something that would change how every person in that room saw that land, but they didn't know it yet. And that was the part that made it powerful. The auctioneer looked at Ethan. Sir, if you're not bidding, I'm going to have to ask. I just need a minute. Still calm, still steady. But now, everyone was watching. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his voice lower controlled. This isn't the time, Ethan. There was no anger in it, just irritation, like something small was interfering with something important. Ethan didn't look at him. Not yet. He reached into the worn leather folder he was carrying. pulled out a stack of papers, not polished, not printed on heavy stock like Daniel's documents, just field reports, handwritten notes, a few lab results clipped together. And then he placed them on the table, right between the auctioneer and the highest bidder. This land isn't what you think it is. Silence, not confusion. Not yet, just a pause, because people didn't know how to process what they were seeing. Daniel exhaled slowly. This has already been evaluated, he said. You're too late. Ethan finally turned toward him. Not the way it should have been. That landed differently, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was certain, and certainty, without noise, carries weight. The auctioneer hesitated. One of the buyers, a man in a dark suit representing a regional agricultural group, stepped forward. What is this? He asked. Ethan answered simply. 3 years of soil stability tests. Water retention tracking. Root depth comparisons across sections. The man frowned slightly. That's all Rituichi factored into yield projections. Ethan shook his head. No, it isn't. And then he pointed to a map, a rough one, hand-marked, lines drawn across the southern section of the land. This part, Ethan said quietly, doesn't behave like the rest of the field. Daniel let out a short breath. We already know that. That's why it lowers the value. Ethan looked at him, and this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not distance, not silence, but clarity. It doesn't lower the value, he said. It changes it. That stopped the room. Because those are not not the same thing. The investor picked up the map, studied it. Explain. Ethan didn't rush, didn't try to impress. He just spoke. The soil there holds water longer than it should. Not on the surface. Below. There's a natural basin layer. It regulates moisture. The man said nothing. Ethan continued. In dry seasons, that section stabilizes faster. Crops don't drop the same way. Roots go deeper. Yield doesn't spike, but it doesn't collapse either. A shift, subtle, but real. Because now, this wasn't about opinion. It was about risk. Daniel stepped in. That's not proven at scale. Ethan nodded. It wasn't. A pause. Then, I tested it. That was the moment everything changed. Because testing means evidence. And evidence, for the first time that day, wasn't on Daniel's side. Ethan slid one of the lab reports forward. Water retention variance, soil density mapping, long-term consistency tracking. Not polished, but undeniable. The investor read it. Once, then again. Slower. And the room went quiet in a different way. Because now people weren't waiting for the auction to continue. They were recalculating. And that's when it happened. The first crack in certainty. The investor looked up, not at Daniel. At Ethan. If this is accurate, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. This land wasn't underperforming. It was misread, and misread assets are the most dangerous kind, because they change value overnight. Daniel stepped forward again. This doesn't change the sale, he said firmly, but his voice wasn't as steady as before, because for the first time, he wasn't controlling the room. Ethan didn't argue, didn't push. He just said one thing. This land isn't built for good years. A pause. It's built for bad ones. And that was the part nobody had considered, because everyone there had been looking at potential profit, not survival, not stability, not long-term resilience. But that's what the land was offering, something deeper than yield. And suddenly, the numbers in everyone's head didn't feel as solid anymore. The auctioneer looked around. No bids, no voices, just thinking, real thinking. The kind that slows everything down. And then, the investor closed the folder, set it down carefully. We need to reassess, he said. That was it. No drama, no announcement. But the impact was immediate. Because when the biggest buyer steps back, everything stops. Daniel stood frozen for a moment. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not now. Not after everything had been finalized. But it had. And there was nothing he could do to pull it back. Because truth doesn't wait for timing. The auction didn't end loudly. It dissolved, quietly, like something that no longer made sense. People stepped back. Whispers replaced bids. Decisions paused. And slowly, the room emptied. Not with excitement, but with uncertainty. Daniel remained near the front, hands still, eyes fixed on the table. Because for the first time, he didn't have the answer. Ethan picked up his papers, turned to leave. Daniel spoke without looking at him. "You should have said something." Ethan stopped, just for a second, then said, "You never asked." And that was it. No argument, no victory, just truth. Weeks passed. The sale never went through. Not the way it was planned. The land stayed, not because of sentiment, but because its value was no longer simple. Daniel's reputation didn't collapse, but it shifted because he had missed something fundamental, and people noticed. He stopped speaking about the farm, stopped treating it like a closed case, because it wasn't, not anymore. Ethan stayed. Of course he did, working the same land, the same way. But now, people came to see it differently, not as wasted potential, but as something rare, something that required understanding. And over time, even Daniel began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to walk the land again, enough to listen, and maybe enough to learn. Because this story was never about an auction, or a sale, or even two brothers. It was about how easily people mistake knowledge for understanding, how quickly they trust what can be measured and ignore what takes time. Daniel saw numbers, and numbers told him to sell. Ethan saw land, and land told him to wait. And in the end, only one of them was right. Because not everything valuable can be priced, and not everything that looks ordinary is simple. Sometimes, the thing everyone is ready to sell is the one thing they never truly understood. And sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the only one who does.